Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we thought we would be very entertaining as we discover a book that's out there about a wonderful person who is both a comedian, actor, and he is also a television correspondent weekly on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He's also been included in films such as The Internship, $1 Million Arm, and today we're going to be talking about his book, No Land's Man, to find out what a wide-eyed British Indian had as an experience as he came here to America. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Aasif Mandvi. Aasif, thank you for joining us.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
You know, it's so interesting to read your book because it's neat when you see people come from foreign lands to America with fresh eyes to make us realize how much we take what we have here for granted, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I wanted to do in the book a little bit was sort of build on that cultural commentary that we do on The Daily Show and sort of use my life, or not my entire life, but just, certain events that have happened to me in the course of my life, having lived in different lands and, born in India, grew up in the UK and America, and use that as a kind of template to sort of point out some of this cultural commentary, and also just make it funny and talk about some of the crazy sort of immigrant experiences that a brown kid has, living in a quote unquote white world and in Hollywood as well.
I remember as I was reading this, it reminded me of someone that I used to know when I was in the United States Navy. And this was a guy that looked like the bullfighter. He just had that look, the thin mustache, the bravado, the broad shoulders. And he even spoke with a really excellent, call it a manly flair, if you will. And we happened to be in South America, and he came to me one day and he says, "Hey, man, how would you like to hang out with me?" And I thought, nobody better than him because he speaks Spanish, and even though in South America it's mostly Portuguese, he had a fairly good handle on it.
Right.
And I thought, why not be with a guy like this? But it was funny to be down there and to be with him, and sometimes as we would be meeting girls, he would sit there and look at me and he'd say, I really don't know what it is they're saying. So I knew we were in for an interesting time. And that was pretty much how it was here for you at times.
Yeah, I mean, I think that.
I think the bullfighting story throws everybody off.
No, I think that well, I mean, look, when I got to the States, it was, I got here and I was thrown into this sort of American high school, and I was 16 years old, and I'd come from like a very sort of conservative British boarding school. And got thrown into this sort of like world of Americana, so it was definitely a cultural, a culture shock on many levels.
Mm-hmm. And one of the big ones was all the food that's here in America.
Yeah, so there's a story in the book. I sort of my poor father. I use him as fodder for my comedy all the time, and I talk about him in the book. That when he first got to America, he went to Florida on a reconnaissance mission, sort of to see if he was going to bring his family to the States. And somebody, I guess, took him out for brunch. So he's out having brunch, and to him, this was the greatest thing that he had ever conceived of, this idea. And he thought it was like a third meal, right? He thought it was like breakfast and lunch, and then in between, there's this third meal called brunch. So I remember he called us. And he was like, in America they have so much food that between breakfast and lunch they have to stop and eat again. It's called brunch.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing. It's $7.99, all you can eat. So he really was just taken with this idea, and I think it was one of the reasons that he fell in love with America.
Well, what's even funnier, too, is that he even went steps further than that, for instance, creating his own IHOP T-shirts to get potentially free pancakes or discounts.
Right. I tell this story about my dad, which is a little bit of an amalgam of other Indian fathers that I've known as well, of this guy who, like, sort of, gets his family to wear these IHOP T-shirts, which say International House of Patel, so that he can go into IHOPs and get free discount, or at least some, not a free discount, but some kind of discount. And what I was trying to do there was like there's a recognition factor. Whenever I've had like people read that story, they always are like, oh, that's my dad. That recognition factor of the immigrant freeloader. You know what I mean? That guy who like shows up here and he's like, I'm going to see if I can get something for nothing. And my dad was definitely one of those kinds of guys who was always looking for a bargain. He was always looking for, a deal. And he embraced America's consumer culture with an open mouth and open arms.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's even fascinating, too, Aasif, as you share that particular story, is the fact that it made you realize, I can see as an immigrant somebody coming here and realizing the bounty, as you described it, America was akin to being Charlie's chocolate factory, and he won the golden ticket, as you said.
Right.
And I found that funny because here he's experiencing, as I think a lot of foreigners do, the idea that this bounty is right at your fingertips. You don't have to struggle and strive, as you were talking about in the book. You felt embarrassed by his antics, but he says, you want to hear what's embarrassing? It's having only one pair of shoes or hanging off the edge of the train, for instance, because you can't afford a seat and on and on. But yet, when they have this attitude, as you were saying, sort of like freeloading or so forth, that's because it's new. It's like the kid in the candy store, and that makes sense. But that Americans also have that same attitude, but for them it's more of a sense of entitlement. There's really a difference there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the story that you're referring to in the book, it sort of actually turns. It turns from this idea of, like, me being embarrassed about my father's sort of, wanting to get a deal and the IHOP T-shirts and all that stuff, and ultimately my father turning that on me and saying, what you don't understand is not only did I come from very meager background, but because I sort of like challenge him by saying, at least in America, even though it's a land of plenty, people don't act like this, and it's a land of moderation and restraint. And he comes back at me with like, what are you, an idiot? You think America is a land of moderation and restraint? And he argues the point of like the obsceneness of America's consumer culture, and the idea that like, he points out, like, have you ever heard of a turducken? This idea of a chicken that is stuffed with a duck, that is stuffed with a turkey, and he says that is a purely American creation. Like nobody else in the world would ever think of eating or inventing such a thing, So the story has this turn of where the commentary is from the immigrant perspective, but then the commentary turns and becomes a commentary in America as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also interesting, too, because there was a point you made in the book that America, because it is made up of so many people who are immigrants, that they kind of think that the rest of the world must be American, It's the same way that New Yorkers think that the rest of America is like New York.
Right. Well, the thing is, when I first got to America, I realized, when growing up as a kid in England, right, you sort of, you always feel as a foreigner, and especially as a South Asian Indian kid, you felt like you would never be truly British. The British have never been completely comfortable with foreigners, and maybe it's because they've been defending their island from invasion for 10,000 years. So in America, when I got here, I found that the opposite was true. Right, the opposite. I was dropped into this high school in the middle of Tampa, Florida, and realized that, like, in America, there's actually, because of the sort of the American sense of itself, like there's very little curiosity about the other cultures and the other parts of the world. So I became invisible. Like people didn't know who I was or where I was from when I got to America, because in America you were either black or you were white, and if you were anything else, or maybe Hispanic, but if you were anything else, you kind of just fell into like this weird invisible place. So I do say in the book that Americans assume that the rest of the world would just be American if they had the choice, and they think, and Americans think about the rest of the world the way New Yorkers think about the rest of America, which is they don't, and that was my experience when I first got here, which was that people didn't know if I was Mexican or Romanian or Indian or whatever, so it was a very interesting time for me in
when you had talked about that, too, especially the New Yorkers, anybody who's ever encountered a New Yorker, God forbid they should also be a chef or a wine connoisseur, is that nobody else does it like they do in New York. As though they're assuming that we're all doing it wrong and only people in New York know how to do anything right.
Well, that's a New Yorker. I would say that is true. Come on, I mean, really. You have to even argue about that.
Well, no, and it's funny, too, because from time to time I would actually look at somebody standing on the pedestal from New York, and I would say, yeah, but New Yorkers don't know how to surf.
Oh, that's
and
true.
They're afraid of big waves and sharks, so go ahead and take your chef and your wine and go somewhere else. Now, tell us how you got started in acting. You could see how it kind of evolves, because you actually mentioned that you just didn't really feel comfortable about who you were, but like you talked about how you would look at your grandmother, for instance, say, she was very confident about who she was, but you felt that acting kind of was one of those directions you could go to be anonymous while at the same time being, I guess, famous.
Yeah.
Creating its own paradox.
I mean, I think that the idea, I don't know if the chicken or the egg came first, but like the idea that I lived in different places and, one of the stories of being an immigrant is that always fitting in, right? Always trying to find a way to fit in. And so I think for me, my proclivity towards being an actor probably somehow came out of that, or maybe I already had that, and then it was just heightened because of my life experience. But that idea of always having moving from different places to places and like having that experience and living in different cultures, and religiously and culturally being an outsider, feeling like an outsider, gravitate towards acting and maybe gravitate towards being an actor and assuming different identities and different shapes. Actors at the end of the day are a little bit we're shapeshifters, and so that was a very freeing place for me in drama class in high school. And there is a line in the book where I say actors want notoriety and invisibility at the same time, and I think that is how I sort of felt.
I know that you were, it was funny because you were describing, because of your accent, you usually played parts in your high school drama class. You were either an alien or an English lord.
Right. Well, I had this English accent, and I was a little brown kid, so people didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know where I was from. They were like, you sound like a Beatle, but you look like, Michael Jackson, and so there was this kind of weird thing where I would end up in improv classes, either playing the Lord of the Manor, who had an English accent, was also an alien lizard type creature. So it was kind of a weird thing until what happened in high school was that I discovered that I could dance like Michael Jackson, and so that was a way to sort of identity in this high school where I was essentially people didn't know what to make of me. It sort of allowed me to be accepted in some way by doing this Michael Jackson impersonation at the talent show in school, and I tell the story about like what that entailed for me and the sort of the idea, which is kind of sums up the idea of the book, that here I was, this Indian English kid with an Indian afro who was imitating a black man who looked like an Indian girl on Tampa High School stage in front of an audience with my grandparents sitting out in the front row, having come from India and have no idea why their son was wearing dark shades and wearing one glove,
I think we still wonder about that with Michael Jackson.
Right.
Oh, fascinating stuff. But, you also bring up that this was the MTV generation, and so you can see how it probably would get easier for people perhaps like yourself as a teenager trying to figure out, what is my identity, how can I show that and be confident and comfortable in my own skin. And MTV really, and I remember as it started out, I think it was about 1980, 81, broadcasting on cable television, was that people were saying, hey, you had to check out this new station. I mean, they play these music videos, right?
Right.
But again, MTV started evolving where it became fashion, lifestyle and all these other things. And you can literally see as though the characters were popping out in America, especially the teenage and the young 20s. It's like, what, did you just come from MTV or what's going on here?
Right.
That must have been kind of crazy at times, especially for your family to see something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like by the time we got here, like it was '82, and MTV had been on the air for a little while. But I remember, like when it first started, people don't realize is MTV was it only played white music. It only played bands that were white.
Right.
You did, and Michael Jackson actually, the album Thriller, like broke the color barrier, and it was the reason that ultimately the door opened for a lot of African American or R&B groups and other stuff. So for me at that point, it was '80s was a phenomenon, and so like me impersonating him and him playing own person was playing with the idea of race. His own brand was all about that. And so from ambiguousness to his racial identity that I embraced because it allowed me to be anything and sort of be accepted and find a voice in the culture.
Now, speaking of, you come from very deeply rooted religious traditions, don't you?
Well,
as far as your family is concerned.
Right, and my family, culturally I'm Muslim, and my family, my grandparents were practicing Muslims, and my parents as well, and, I personally have often said that I've been in more bars than mosques in my life, but yes, I think on a cultural level, there is an identification with just as way the many Jews in America have that cultural identification with Judaism.
Well, I thought I'd bring that up because it must have been interesting to come and see, a culture that seems so freewheeling. Like, at one moment you could be a Muslim, but then all of a sudden you decide you want to become a Zen Buddhist, and that's okay here.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to see that there's a level of like. Else came, and that story of like sort of freedom, freedom and social tolerance and all that kind of stuff, which then changed after 9/11. And suddenly, and I talk about this in the book as well, in terms of like after 9/11, Muslims were being looked at in a very different way, and suddenly America was not as tolerant, and it was not as open, and it was not as free as the land that we had come to. And that was a very eye-opening and disillusioning kind of moment for especially because I was right. I was in New York City when it happened, and it was a moment for me as a never really having even thought about my Muslim identity. Suddenly, it became first and foremost in terms of how people recognized me.
Now, going to your movie, for instance, $1 Million Arm, a lot of times you'll see what are known as Bollywood films. It seems everybody breaks out into the middle of a particular line and they start singing and dancing, and you're thinking, well, that's kind of entertaining and colorful.
Right.
But do you sometimes feel that when, for instance, someone like you comes to America, you become an actor, and maybe you kind of waver into being an Indian, that they kind of typecast you into those kinds of roles where they all seem to speak the same way?
Right. Well, I mean, look, as a South Asian and as an Indian, coming to America and working in this business, absolutely there was a certain level of typecasting, and I talk about it in the book in one of the stories that I tell called patanking, which is that you go to these auditions when I was starting out, and they would have you. Other Indian actor friends would sort of joke about it. We'd say like, did they make you patank? And or did they ask you to patank? And patanking, what it is the sound of an Indian accent heard to a Westerner. So it sort of goes patank, 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 And so like if they asked you to patank, it usually meant trouble because that was what they were going to end up using in the thing. They were going to want you to do that. So and it's also kind of like the idea of a disembodied accent, which is often I would go in for roles that would just basically. I said to one casting director once, I think I said, I'm glad you've written a character for an Indian actor, but it's a shame that you've never actually ever met an Indian person because we don't talk like this, And so there was a kind of sense of that stereotyping that you had to deal with in that caricaturization, the cartoon sort of version of what it was to be Indian. In fact, one of my first auditions in New York was a snake charmer. and the casting director asked me if I actually knew how to snake charm. And, I was so desperate for the work because I was a young actor and I needed to pay the rent. I said, I don't know how to snake charm, but I am Indian, so it could be in my DNA.
I don't know if this is true. Do you know anything about snake charming? I mean, from your experience growing up?
See, now you're doing exactly the same thing.
Well, no, I
wondered.
Now
asking me exactly what I asked.
Well, you brought up the snake charming. I had to. No, it was interesting. I came across a program one time, because we all look at snake charming as being this sensual yet dangerous thing all at the same time because, cobra bites you, it's going to be bad news. But I discovered, or what was being suggested, was that they actually removed the poison glands out of the cobra.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they do remove the poison glands. I watched that same documentary, I
think. Now, sexuality in America is really different, isn't it?
Well,
Talk about Katie, for instance.
What you're talking about, doesn't it, really?
Katie was an interesting person.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Katie was an interesting person.
Oh, yes. So that actually didn't happen in America. That happened in England.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, but
I think it's because when you said Scooby-Doo, I immediately started assuming it was America.
No. It was a young girl that I went to school with in England when I was very, very young, and clearly, I mean, it's actually a very when you read between the lines of that story, which is funny in some ways, it's also very heartbreaking because clearly this young girl was having some kind of there was some kind of sexual misconduct going on in her home, and this young girl would ask the boys to line up and touch her vagina, and she was like 7 or 8 years old. And whenever I've read that story out to people, there's a gasp in the audience, when I've read it out loud, because people recognize that under the sort of guise of like these children doing this silly thing and my sort of burgeoning sexuality as a young kid, like discovering this thing, there's also a very dark story of a young girl clearly being traumatized in some way.
And the truth is, too, is that resonates, I think, with people so harshly because in high schools especially, you see a lot of that kind of subtly going on, the typecasting that actually goes along. Sure, this girl's now kissing this guy, now this guy, and now all of a sudden she's this. What they have to put up and deal with through the rest of their, if they even stay in school. And so, you read something like that and you start thinking at first, well, this seems kind of cute, but then all of a sudden, like you said, you realize, I see what's happening here, and it starts reminding you of people that you've actually been in school with.
Yeah, and some, and look, this is a terrible disease in our culture, that happens, and like I said, the story is not about that, but in many of these cases where I'm telling a humorous story that you might be laughing, I hope to also be like sort of projecting. There often, I didn't do it on purpose. I think it just sort of happened that often there is an injection of sadness or tragedy behind.
Well, I think, too, it's the idea that, especially here in America, we tend to be fairly open about a lot of things. There was a time years ago I was interviewing a psychologist, and she had wrote a book called The Middle of Everywhere. And apparently the greatest concentration of immigration happens to be in Lincoln, Nebraska, and was talking about the challenges that these different cultural classes have trying to integrate into a system in America, to be able to thrive and grow, and how difficult that is, and how, for instance, as an American, we grew up with this particular system, so we began to believe that there are liberties that we have here that can be exercised somewhere else. And they gave an example, for instance, very beautiful woman, she was saying, who was, I think, about 22 years old, of a Muslim background. She had 3 sisters, had people just doting left and right, sending roses and flowers, that all of a sudden, because you want a date with this person, that you think they're just supposed to say yes and go, but there are traditions and ways about things that you go about it. And so that kind of acclimation just doesn't happen very easily here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there are that sometimes is there are different Americas for different people. There is an America that white people experience. There's a very different America that black people experience. South Asians or all these are versions of the American. We often focus on just one of those. We think of America as just sort of like one culture, but it's really not. It is. Diwali can be as much an American holiday as Christmas.
What has it been like as you've been having this book out there of the response from people?
People really are enjoying the book. I'm very glad to say. When you write a book, you sort of sit in a room for clack on your computer, and you tell these stories, and you hope that people are very honored and flattered and humbled by the amount of people that have really look. And I think I've tried to tell these stories with and but I like I said, I wanted to do something with the mission of what I've done on the Daily Show, which that cultural commentary and stories of the immigrant experience. Many Americans can identify. A very American story because it is one of people. That is the American story, having all these different identities in one place,
And even better so when you get to have that fresh perspective. Again, you're kind of in the territory, so you get used to the landscape.
Yeah.
Having somebody else come in, experience that with enthusiasm.
Right. Well, that's the thing also. Like my thought, for example, even something as simple as brunch. Suddenly, Americans have grown up with brunch years, but to my father, it was this amazing thing, and it represented something that I think people forget, and so that perspective, I think, is often interesting and hopefully
Well, it's funny because as I got to that chapter, I had just been to the theater down the street the day before, and the argument that your father and you got into about how you wanted a medium Coke and he demanded that you pay 37 cents more and get the large one, right?
Right.
So I'm at this theater, and it's Tuesday night. You're already spending $5 to go see the newest movie, which is a great discount. On top of that, on Tuesday, they give you the free pop. I'm sorry?
You only spent $5. That's pretty good.
It's very good. It's Tuesday night. It's at a Regal Cinema. It's a multiplex, state of the art.
Good.
But it's funny because on top of that, because you're a member, because you get your free little card, this is only in America, is that you get $2 popcorn, $2 nacho, and $2 hot dogs, I think it is, okay? So you step up to the counter and you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to pay $2 for a small popcorn, which is a reasonable size, but you realize for $1 more you can get a medium, okay? Now that's a big bag of popcorn that two people can share, but then you decide you want a drink, okay? So you decide, I'm going to get the small, which I think is 32 ounces. Would you like to get the larger one for 50 cents? I'm like, you need a wheelbarrow to roll these things into the theater, and I'm thinking, how much do we need?
Yeah. Well, that is kind of the story, the upselling, right?
Right.
And so the idea that, how much is enough, how much is too much, and that argument is in the story actually of this idea that you're not going to eat that much popcorn, you're not going to drink, you don't need to drink that much soda, even if it is only 50 cents more. Perhaps, I think order that much soda, it doesn't mean we should necessarily.
I'll tell you, that movie WALL-E was pretty accurate, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
God knows I've sat in plenty of theaters where I've seen people just like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Very entertaining. You know, it's so refreshing when you get an opportunity to read stories like yours and get that fresh perspective, because sometimes, even as an American, I look around and I think, am I the only one who's noticing these things?
Right.
Is there a website people can find out more?
Well, you can go to my Facebook page,
Okay.
where I am always posting things about the book. You can follow me on Twitter at Aasif, and the book is available wherever books are sold, online or in bookstores.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on the program today. Nice, refreshing look on what it is to be completely American.
Yes, thank you very much.
You bet, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the Jon Stewart Show.
Thank you.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Again, the book is No Land's Man. Pick it up. I think you'll enjoy very much what you'll read between the pages. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.